If you've been online at any period at all and you've been engaged in Roman Catholic apologetics, been engaging Rome's defenders on discussion boards, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube discussions, very quickly you find out that a lot of people dedicated to Roman Catholicism have a lot to say about Martin Luther. And in fact, a lot of that, of what they say, is very, very negative, ranging from, Luther was just this awful person to Luther was that which tore asunder the church. He's blamed for almost everything. In those studies, I found out that it wasn't true that all Roman Catholics do not like Martin Luther. I found some Roman Catholics saying some very kind and nice things about Martin Luther. And these weren't just layman Catholics. These were Roman Catholic popes. They were their scholars. They were their theologians. So what was going on? The big question that pervades this entire presentation is, why has Rome, or the Roman Catholic Church, or Roman Catholic theologians, why have they treated Luther so differently throughout the centuries?
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo. This channel is a place where I like to do church history videos, apologetics videos, and theology videos, mainly focusing on what we would call quote-unquote Protestant apologetics, insofar as Protestantism is an umbrella. If there's something that you guys get at home, please let it be that. I say it almost every video. Protestantism is not its own tradition or its own church. It's an umbrella to describe a lot of different traditions that stem from the Reformation. And today we'll be talking about the Roman Catholic Church's treatment of Martin Luther, and Martin Luther quotes in particular. And so I have a very cool guest with me today, James Swan. James is the owner of the blog Beggars All Reformation and Apologetics, setting the record straight on the Protestant Reformation. How are you doing, James?
Thank you, sir. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Like I was telling you off camera, I love your blog. That's like my #1 place. Every time I run into a Martin Luther quote that's being used in polemics against Protestants, I'm like, I need to run this by the Beggars All Reformation blog, because 9 times out of 10, it's either just a false quote or it's completely ripped out of context. And I know I can imagine it's grueling work, and it's just having to sit down and do all this research, but you have no idea. Oh, sorry, my computer there freaked out for a second. Yeah, you have no idea how much people actually benefit from your work.
Well, I appreciate that. What's funny is sometimes I'll be researching a quote that I've never heard before, and I wind up back on my own blog, and I go, oh, I did this. I did this a couple of years ago. I've written so much, I don't remember all the specifics of every quote. So it serves as a record for me to actually remember what I've done, what I've found. So, but thank you so much. That's really, I really enjoy hearing that something I put together is beneficial to you, to the church, to people as they struggle through these issues between the Reformation, Roman Catholicism, Reformed theology, Lutheran theology. So it's a real blessing to me, to use the Christianese word blessing. It's a real blessing to me to know that people are actually enjoying what I'm doing.
I'm just really happy to have you on. I'm really happy to get to shine a spotlight on your blog for people to check out as you deal with just misinformation, and most of the time also just either made up quotes or out of context misquotes of not just Luther, but other reformers as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So with that, we have you on today to do a presentation on some of the history of the Roman Catholic treatment of Martin Luther. And then I have a few questions for you after that. So let me just get your PowerPoint up here.
I appreciate it.
And I will get out of your way and let you get to your presentation.
All right, thanks. Well, you had asked me to do a brief history of Rome's treatment of Martin Luther over the centuries. And if you've been online at any period at all and you've been engaged in Roman Catholic apologetics, been engaging Rome's defenders on discussion boards, on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube discussions, very quickly you find out that a lot of people dedicated to Roman Catholicism have a lot to say about Martin Luther. And in fact, a lot of that, of what they say, is very, very negative, ranging from, Luther was just this awful person to Luther was that which tore asunder the church. He's blamed for almost everything. So early on, when I started to interact with Roman Catholics, I found this sort of sentiment being put out a lot, and I decided to do my own kind of like a book report about the way the Roman Catholic Church, particularly Rome scholars, had understood this person, Martin Luther. And you can actually find these two book reports I did. They're from 2003. They're on my website, the Beggars All website. They're on the sidebar. They're called something like The Roman Catholic Understanding of Martin Luther. And in those studies, I found out that it wasn't true that all Roman Catholics do not like Martin Luther. I found some Roman Catholics saying some very kind and nice things about Martin Luther. And these weren't just layman Catholics. These were Roman Catholic popes. They were their scholars. They were their theologians. So what was going on? The big question that pervades this entire presentation is, why has Rome, or the Roman Catholic Church, or Roman Catholic theologians, why have they treated Luther so differently throughout the centuries? Why? Why aren't they unified as to how they understand Martin Luther? So if you were to go all the way back to the 16th century, all the way back to 1520, when this controversy was really spilling out everywhere, you have the papal bull of Pope Leo X in 1520 saying, "Arise, O Lord, and judge thy cause. A wild boar has invaded thy vineyard." Luther, of course, being that wild animal that had come into the church, had come into Christendom. And towards the end of the quote, the Pope says, "Arise, all ye saints, and the whole universal church, whose interpretations of Scripture has been assailed." So that was one of the nicer things that Pope Leo actually said about Luther. And if you're familiar with the history, you know that Luther went on to have the term heretic thrown at him. He was hunted. Well, he wasn't captured, but there was always the possibility that he was going to be hunted down, captured, tried for heresy. So that whole idea pervaded during Luther's life. He was always worried about assassination attempts. There was one point where he was worrying about being poisoned by people trying to take him out of the game. Now, fast forward all the way to 2016, right on the eve of the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, you find Pope Francis saying to a group of Lutherans and other people that were there at this meeting in the Vatican, he said, "With gratitude, we acknowledge that the Reformation helped give greater centrality to sacred Scripture in the Church's life." And if you look at my PowerPoints, you'll see on the corner there's a picture of Pope Francis, and there's this mysterious red figure standing next to him. That is actually a statue of Martin Luther that was presented to the Vatican. I'm pretty sure the thing is still there. I don't know for sure. I haven't done any further research on it since this story actually broke. And the yellow scarf that's actually around the statue's neck, the Pope put that scarf on Luther's neck to commemorate the Lutherans that were present there at that meeting. So it's fascinating to me. All of a sudden, you go from Luther being this arch enemy of the church in 1520. Now, all of a sudden, in 2016, he's this being that gave greater certainty to centrality to the sacred Scriptures in the church's life. So why has Rome treated differently throughout the years? That's the million-dollar question. Why do you have such discrepancies? And the best answer that I've been able to uncover was not written by a Protestant apologist. It wasn't put out by James White or Lorraine Bettner or Dave Hunt or anybody like that. The answer that I found was actually from a Roman Catholic historian from the 20th century named Hubert Jedden. And this person was actually an expert on the Council of Trent. That was his magnum opus, was his searches into the Council of Trent to go through all the meetings and what happened. And he pointed out something that really I found extremely fascinating, that, of course, if you read the dogmatic decrees of the Council of Trent, they most certainly said that justification by faith alone is anathema. That's absolutely there. Or you can find that they chose to include the apocryphal books in the Old Testament. And there's other places where they were definitely against Protestant theology, broad general Protestant theology. But what they did not do at the Council of Trent is they did not name Luther by name. There's nothing in the dogmatic decree that says, We reject Martin Luther. And what Hubert Jeden said was, there's no dogmatic statement that binds the consciences of Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics are free to think that Martin Luther was a heretic. They're also free to think that, hey, he wasn't such a bad guy, that he was a spiritual guy, and we'll get into some of that as well. So I find that very interesting, that when you dialogue with Roman Catholics, you're actually utilizing their personal opinions. You're hearing their personal opinions about Martin Luther. You're not hearing anything dogmatic that the church has actually said about Martin Luther. So I want to just give just a quick overview of the way Roman Catholic scholars, theologians have reacted to Martin Luther over the centuries. It is a fascinating study. And from the get-go, I brought some books out just to show people some of the things that really intrigued me and helped me in this process of learning about the ways Roman Catholics responded to Martin Luther. One is a book called Luther's Earliest Opponents by David Bagchi. The book is a phenomenal overview of the early opponents, the way they actually responded to Martin Luther. A very fair book. It's not some sort of Protestant polemic. So if anybody's really interested in that, please, by all means, track that book down. So the Roman Catholics published responses to Luther that were authorized responses to Luther early on. That is, it wasn't as if some Roman Catholic person was in Germany someplace and he heard about Luther, or he read one of Luther's books and he thought, this stuff is terrible, I've got to write a response and have it published. No, that's not what happened. What happened is that the people that wrote against Martin Luther in the early days were actually authorized by either the secular authorities or the ecclesiastical superiors to write against Martin Luther. And they weren't just the regular layman on the street. These were people that had some standing within the church or within a religious order. Now, think about that. Contrast that with what's going on today. With what's going on today, Roman Catholic apologists and even Protestant apologists, myself included, we just publish whatever we want to. But that was not the case back then. There was an authority structure which provoked these publications to come out. So some of the early names, Tetzel, Johannes Eck, Emser, Cochlaeus, that we'll get to in a minute, they responded to Luther. And the way they responded was very interesting. They didn't just write these emotional tomes responding back to Luther. They were set up like disputations. They were point-by-point refutations. And if you've ever had somebody respond to something you've posted on your YouTube channel or something you've been in dialogue with, every once in a while you'll find somebody that's so into what you're saying that they've got to respond to you point by point. Those are terrible things to read. They're just so hard to read. I've done a couple of them myself, and I go back and I read them and I go, what was I thinking? Who can read these point-by-point refutations? They're very cumbersome, they're repetitive, and they're not really appealing to the general masses. I actually have one right here that I'll put up for the camera. This is one by John Eck. It's the Enchiridion of Commonplaces Against Luther and Other Enemies of the Church. I had to see for myself what some of these early responses were like. And it is true. It's a terrible, terrible read. This book cost me a lot of money. I don't read it very often. Anyway, the Protestants at this time in the early 1520s were really winning the publishing and propaganda war against the Roman Catholic Church for that very reason. Their materials were much, much more readable than what Rome was putting out. And really interesting, if you're interested in that topic at all, about the propaganda wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, fascinating stuff. I recommend two books. One is by a guy named, they're both by the same guy, Stephen Osment. This is called The Reformation in the Cities. This is really interesting how the publishing war influenced all the places in Germany. And he also did another book called Protestants, The Birth of a Revolution. Same idea. He goes through all these publishing wars between the Catholics and the Protestants to document exactly what happened. So with that said, as we move along, the most important person both recognized by Protestant scholars and Roman Catholic scholars, that responded to Martin Luther early on was a man named Johannes Cochlaeus. He's the most well-known Roman Catholic controversialist that responded to Luther. He was a humanist. He was an ordained priest. He had higher education. And the man spent most of his life writing against Luther, and that's what he remembered for. Publishers were more prone to print Protestant books, Protestant sermons during this period because they made money. People were buying them. They were easily digestible. They weren't these long scholastic sort of treatises responding to Luther point by point. So Cochlaeus found a way around this about not being published. He actually maintained his own printing press to make sure he was published, which I think is very clever. So here's just a brief blurb paragraph from my paper, the Roman Catholic Understanding of Luther, just to give you an overview. He doesn't say this in every paragraph of his book, but these are some of the thoughts included generally in his overall work of Martin Luther. He held that Luther was a child of the devil, the fruit of a union between Satan and Luther's mother, and Luther's mother later regretted not having murdered him in the cradle. Luther lusts after wine and women. He's without conscience. He approves any means to gain his end. Luther is a liar, a hypocrite, cowardly and quarrelsome, demonic monstrosities boiled out of Luther's powerful, perverted mind. And at Luther's death, Satan came and dragged him off to hell. Interesting about that is there was, I believe it was a nun a century or two later. I don't remember the exact name nor the century, but she had a vision of Luther in hell. So you can Google that. You could probably come up with her description of Martin Luther being tormented in hell. That was a very, very popular idea during that period, that these heretics go straight to hell. Before leaving what Cochlaeus actually said, a book came out a couple years ago. It's called Luther's Lives. It's two contemporaries' accounts of Martin Luther. The first is from Melanchthon, and the second, almost the majority of this book, is Cochlaeus himself. The guy did the first large-scale biography of Martin Luther, and because he was a contemporary of Luther's, so the guy went through all Luther's writings that he could get a hold of and actually wrote a year-by-year commentary of Luther's life. So that's pretty interesting to figure out that the very first meaningful biography of Luther was not from a friend of Martin Luther, but rather by one of Luther's arch nemesis. But the most, I think the most interesting thing that Cochlaeus put out, and this was later on after he kind of moved away from the scholastic point-by-point refutations, is he started creatively writing. He did this one dialogue. It's called Seven-Headed Luther. And on my PowerPoint, you can see a little picture there. It's a monk's body with 7 heads coming out of the monk's body. And what Cochlaeus did is he did a fictional dialogue between 7 different Martin Luthers, because he believed that Martin Luther was internally contradictory, that there were all sorts of Martin Luthers. He had the one doctor had and if you look at the picture, one of them had a doctor's cap. That was Martin Luther, the theologian. Another one was Martin Luther, the monk. One was Martin Luther wearing a turban. The other Martin Luther was one that preached to the mob, whatever he wanted to hear. The other one was a fanatic with hair on his hand, on his hair, surrounded by hornets. Now, what's really interesting about this book is, and I heard about this dialogue for years. God bless the internet. So much stuff is available now. The book, the dialogue that Cochlaeus actually wrote, is actually available now to English speakers. And it's found in a book called Luther as Heretic, 10 Catholic Responses to Luther. My version, I can't fit any more books in my personal library. So I buy Kindle books now because I just ran out of room. But I suggest tracking that down. You will read not only this dialogue about the way Cochlaeus thought that Luther was internally contradictory and contradicted himself, but there's 9 other responses in there from this time period about Martin Luther. Very, very fascinating reading. Well, one thing this guy's known for is setting the tone for the Roman Catholic responses to Martin Luther up until the 20th century. Scholars, both Protestant and Catholics, are generally agreed that Cochlaeus maybe they weren't quoting him, but he actually set the tone for the way Roman Catholics were going to understand Luther through the centuries. I'm going to only skip through the 17th and 18th centuries. There's really nobody of really significant importance to mention there. Obviously, there were Roman Catholics writing about Martin Luther during that time period. But when you get up into the later 18th century, early 19th century, two guys stand out. One is von Dollinger, and the other one is Johannes Jansen. Von Dollinger is very interesting because he was excommunicated for opposing papal primacy. But his works were heavily cited and heavily utilized on his interpretation of Martin Luther. And one thing he was very, very popular for was the idea that, I have it in bold there, the Protestant Reformation, judged according to its fruits, was a soul-murdering heresy. There's a whole genre of Roman Catholic responses out there that Luther regretted the Protestant Reformation, that the Protestant Reformation was a failure. It caused all this tragedy and travesty throughout the world. The world is a much worse place because of the Protestant Reformation. Well, von Dollinger was one of the people that really highlighted that particular idea. And you can find on my Beggars All blog, someplace towards the top, I have a category called Did Luther Regret the Reformation? There's a bunch of posts on that topic. The next one, Jansen, he, another really influential theologian, historian, he has this massive set that is available online. I believe it's on the Internet Archive on the history of the German people. And he was another guy that saw Luther as destroying German culture and piety. He actually argued the church was actually flourishing up until Luther came in and tried to destroy it. And he, just like Cochlaeus, he saw Luther as being a sick soul with inferior character. I mention these guys because you will find them still cited today. Their works were standard for a long time, even though maybe modern scholars don't utilize them to the extent that they did, say, in the 20th century. The next guy, one of my all-time favorites, Heinrich Denifle, that I used to mispronounce as Denophile for many years. Heinrich Denifle, he was an extremely popular Roman Catholic Dominican historian in the 19th century. And I also think he was a very good preacher, if I recall reading that. One really interesting fact about this guy is he was the first person to utilize Luther's 1515 to 1516 Romans commentary notes. Luther preached or taught through Romans previous to 1517. And scholars and historians up to this point didn't realize they actually had a copy of Luther's notes from these lectures. And so if you look in the historical record, you won't find them being cited in the 17th century, 18th century. You won't find them there. So what happened was, in order for Denifle to do his biography of Luther, it was a very big biography, he was given access to the Vatican archives, and lo and behold, he found Luther's commentary notes there. And the Protestant world was a little upset about this, that the Catholic world actually had something that the Protestant world did not. And so the search was on to see if any other copies of these notes were available. And not long thereafter, Protestants actually did find the same thing, another copy of Luther's commentary notes. But I just think it's really an interesting twist that it was a Roman Catholic that was actually producing Luther's works at the time. So anyway, he wrote an extensive multi-volume set on Luther. The first volume is in English, and it is available online. I think it's on Google Books. You can find it on the Internet Archive. It's one of the few books that I actually did not buy at the time. I'm glad I didn't, because I would have spent a lot of money. But only the first book is translated. It's there for you to read. And here's just a brief paragraph of what this person thought about Martin Luther. He says, Luther was a fallen away monk with unbridled lust, a theological ignoramus, an evil man. He used immorality to begin the Reformation. He accuses Luther of buffoonery, hypocrisy, pride, ignorance, forgery, slander, pornography, vice, debauchery, drunkenness, seduction, corruption, and more. He's a knave, a liar, a blackguard, a sot, or worse. He goes as far as saying that Luther was infected with the venereal disease, syphilis. So one thing that you can probably see even in that paragraph, that this particular writer was really interesting in the morality, the sexual morality of Martin Luther, even though at the time the books were considered very popular, and they were considered scholarly at the time. Generally speaking, you will not find any modern Catholic or Protestant scholars or historians utilizing Denis Flay's writings as anything serious in an attempt to understand Martin Luther. They don't look at his work at all and use it as a primary source for understanding who Luther was. The next one in this line is really my absolutely all-time favorite Roman Catholic historian on Martin Luther, and he's actually somebody who's not all that kind to Martin Luther, but I'll tell you why I like him in a minute. Hartmann Grisar is a German historian, church historian, Catholic historian. His documentation is impeccable, absolutely impeccable. He produced a massive biography of Luther, something like this big. It's 6 huge volumes with small type print. And I look at the man's documentation and I'm blown away. He did that without computers, without search engines. It's unbelievable. When I check his documentation, it's spot on. I know if he quotes Luther saying something, that quote is going to be found in Luther's works, in Luther's written corpus, his extant writings. It's going to be there. The guy's documentation was that good. So he came right after Denis Flay. He tried to actually tone down a little bit of what Denis Flay said, but he basically said sort of the same stuff, just he said it nicer. So a little blurb on this guy is that Hartmann Grisar was a Jesuit historian who used Freudian psychology, which was gaining popularity at the time, at the assessment that Luther was a monk obsessed with the lust of the flesh and a pathological manic depressive personality. So here you find the psychological aspect being brought in along with Luther's lust problem. Luther, for Grisar, Luther's view of justification by faith alone came from his own immorality. That is, in order to justify his loose life and to excuse his renunciation of the monastic ideal, Luther denied salvation with works. So the whole Protestant Reformation, according to Grisar, was put together because Luther had to find a way to deal with his own internal lust and his neurosis. Grisar sees Luther as the victim of bad heredity. That's some of the studies went into Luther's parents at this point. Was Luther an abused child? A lot of people have concluded he was. That's a whole other topic. He was a maladjusted misfit entering the monastic life because of some traumatic experience during a thunderstorm. Another thing very, very popular was that Luther did not venture into the monastery, honestly, that he really should not have ever been allowed to enter into the monastery because he wasn't really monastery material. So they try to downplay the fact that the guy was sincerely trying to get into the monastery. Grisar argues that Luther was simply a neurotic man who spent his entire life unhappy and guilt-ridden. So following him, I mentioned this source, and like I said, there's all other sources that I could mention, but these I think are the most popular. Back when I first started interacting with Roman Catholic apologists or people committed to defending Roman Catholicism, lots of times they would cite the Old Catholic Encyclopedia, which is from the early 1900s, and that makes sense. I mean, if you're going to quote something about Martin Luther, hey, why not quote an encyclopedia? I mean, encyclopedias are supposed to have this correct, accurate knowledge. The Catholic Encyclopedia set is a massive set with a lot of documentation. It's still online, and Catholics in the early 2000s utilized it. And no fault on them. I mean, if there's an encyclopedia, I would probably think, okay, that's probably a safe source. Well, this person that wrote the article in the Catholic Encyclopedia, he was actually influenced by Denis Flay and Grisar that came before him. His name was George Gans. He presented a wild-tempered Luther depressed and mentally ill. Luther was the victim of lust, seeking unbridled sexual license. There it is again. Through his teaching, Luther ended up abandoned by most of his friends and colleagues, dejected and despairing, tortured in body and spirit. And once again, that whole theme that towards the end of his life, Luther allegedly regretted the Reformation and died this sick, lonely, dejected, despairing man who dejected exactly what he did in the Protestant Reformation. Now, if you ever come across somebody mentioning the old Catholic Encyclopedia article on Luther, the best response to that is to say, hey, are you aware of the new Catholic Encyclopedia? So what's interesting is in the 1960s, a new Catholic Encyclopedia came out, one of these other official Roman Catholic sort of encyclopedias. And the article in the new Catholic Encyclopedia is completely different than the old Catholic Encyclopedia. Luther in the new Catholic Encyclopedia was a sincere person that had sincere theological motives. And hey, guess what? Indulgences at the time were really actually a bad thing. Some of the older Roman Catholic historians and theologians were trying to point out that indulgences weren't really all that bad. It was a worthy endeavor to rebuild St. Peter's. Moving on, we move into somebody that really has meant a lot to me in my studies of Martin Luther and Roman Catholic apologetics, and that's Father Patrick O'Hare's The Facts About Luther that came out around 1916, 1917. Father Patrick O'Hare, he was an American priest, not far from me. He was out in Brooklyn, New York, if I recall correctly. And just like around the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther, the 400th anniversary of the nailing of the 95 Theses was also a big deal. So it's a great time to come out with a book that's called The Real Facts, or The Facts About Luther. And here's a copy of my one of the original copies of The Facts About Luther. Price, it says 25 cents. It's no longer 25 cents. He took the information from Denis Flay and Grisard, and he made it accessible for English people to understand. He really disseminated their ideas for an American audience. His references are horrific. This was one of the first books by a Roman Catholic that I bought about Martin Luther, and the documentation, some of the documentation is just plain wrong. Some of it doesn't make any sense. It's my general feeling that the man probably did not look at any Martin Luther books when he composed The Facts About Luther. Now, even though the Catholic press at the time gave him accolades for the book, I don't know how widely it was disseminated then amongst Roman Catholics, or how many people actually bought it. But it did gain a lot of popularity in the 1990s and early 2000s because TAN, a Roman Catholic publisher, republished the book, and it's probably became more popular now than it was then. So here's the TAN reprint, and you can see that they've used the red lettering here that's very similar to, say, like a Nazi sort of lettering. But the book became very, very popular. When I first started getting involved in looking up Roman Catholic quotes, I found that a lot of the quotes that were being put out on the internet were actually from Patrick O'Hare. So here's just a quick overview of Father O'Hare. He presents a Luther who is not only mad, but morally depraved and corrupt. He asserted that Luther lived in the Wartburg and was in close touch with Satan. So when Luther was in hiding, Luther did a fictitious story as a literary device in one of his writings, in which he has a dialogue with the devil. I don't recall the name of the treatise, but it is in Luther's works. In the English edition, you can find it. But it's obviously a fictitious story. Well, some Roman Catholics, and I think either Father Patrick O'Hare might have even picked up on this as well. I don't remember off the top of my head, but that actually was happening. That Luther was actually documenting an actual conversation he had with Satan, which is not true. Anyway, O'Hare asserts that Luther was in the Wartburg, was in close touch with Satan, and Luther lived indecently, decried celibacy and virginity. There it is again. sanctioned adultery. He dishonored marriage. He authorized prostitution and polygamy, that Luther was a drunkard and a frequenter of taverns who preached his theology in the fumes of alcohol in the midst of his fellow revolutionaries. It's not uncommon still to find this idea that Luther was some sort of alcoholic and that he was a drunkard, which is not true either. O'Hare attributes to Luther a fickle and cunning character, an inordinate impudence, an unbridled presumption, a titanic pride, a despotic nature, and a spirit of blasphemy. Luther was a blasphemer, a libertine, a revolutionary, a hater of religious vows, a disgrace to the religious calling. And remember, Father O'Hare is a priest, so that Luther ceased being a priest really struck a chord with him. That Luther was an enemy of domestic felicity, the father of divorce, the advocate of polygamy, and the propagator of immorality and open licentiousness. So I was so intrigued by this book when I first got it. I thought that I could make a master list of all the quotes of Luther that Father O'Hare used, so that way maybe people could Google the quote and they would come across my page of quotes from Father O'Hare about Martin Luther. I sort of gave up on it, but it's still there. There's so many out of context quotes with poor documentation that come out of this book that was so influential to Roman Catholics online in the early 2000s. One set of quotes that Father O'Hare really brought to popularity during the late 1990s, early 2000s with Roman Catholics were Luther's comments about the canon of sacred scripture. And what's interesting to me is that the Catholic controversialists during the 16th century did not spend a lot of time arguing with Luther about the canon of scripture. Yet, when you fast forward to the early 2000s, Catholics are pointing out how bad Martin Luther was on the canon. It's just an interesting disconnect for me. Well, Father O'Hare brought up a lot of these quotes. One he used is that the history of Jonah is so monstrous that it is absolutely incredible. The idea being that, you know, Jonah is not a true book in the Bible, according to Luther. But when you read this particular quote in context, you find out that Luther is not denying the historicity of Jonah at all. Another popular quote that still pops up from time to time is Luther is purported to have said, "The book of Esther I toss into the Elbe River." And it's actually an secondhand comment that Luther is purported to have said. It's not something that he actually wrote down. But there's actually a textual variant in the original document where this quote comes from. It wasn't Esther, it was Esdras that Luther was going to toss into the Elbe. The other one that Father O'Hare points out is that the book of Job for Luther, Job spoke not as it stands written in this book, but only had such thoughts. It is merely the argument of a fable. And it's actually a mistranslation. The quote should be, Job didn't speak the way it is written in the book, but he thought those things. One doesn't speak that way under temptation, and Luther is purported to have says it's almost like a fable, not that it is a fable. And then Luther goes on to say, nevertheless, these things reported actually happened. And finally, another quote that Father Patrick O'Hare popularized in the early 2000s, that if you're papist, Luther is purported to have said, if your papist annoys you with the word alone in Romans 3:28, tell him straight away that Dr. Martin Luther will have it so. And it's a real quote. It comes from Luther's letter on open translating. But if you actually read Luther's open letter on translating, you'll find out that, yes, he does say that quote. And he said that quote for a very interesting reason, is that there was a Roman Catholic that actually had plagiarized Luther's translation of the New Testament at the time and criticized Luther for it. So Luther was pretty angry about that. But then he goes on to actually explain in detail why that in the German text he saw that the word alone was necessary to include in his German translation. Leaving those gentlemen aside, the destructive criticism of Martin Luther, we turn to the positive Roman Catholic perspectives of Martin Luther that really started in the earlier 20th century, kind of around the time that O'Hare had written his facts about Luther. And Richard Stauffer, I believe he's a Catholic writer, he's noted, if one wants to sum up briefly the path of Roman Catholic Luther scholars have trodden since 1904, one could say that they passed from destructive criticism to a respectful encounter. And the difference between the earlier approaches to Luther that were fueled by Cochlaeus and the later approaches that started occurring in the 20th century is the earlier approaches really sought to attack Luther as a person. You find a lot about Luther's character being addressed, being attacked. Whereas in the 20th century, Roman Catholic scholars now are looking at him as an honest theologian, as a sincere religious man. So even with these more positive approaches to Luther, you're not going to find an overwhelming consensus on Luther. They're still going to differ amongst themselves. For instance, some of the more positive approaches to Luther still think Luther's a victim of subjectivism, that he was making up his own theology. Some still accuse Luther from psychological perspectives, that there was something wrong with him in terms of his mental capacities. But overall, the consensus in the 20th century is that Luther is not this evil spawn of hell. He was a sincere religious person that got into the conflict with Rome honestly. The most important guy for the entire 20th century Roman Catholic Luther approaches is a man named Joseph Lortz. And I have here on my PowerPoint, he was the most famous Catholic Luther scholar of the 20th century. And he's usually, even though he's probably not the first, but he's usually seen as the first Catholic author to put forth a full-length treatment of Martin Luther without vilifying him. And so just all that stuff we just talked about, listen to how Lortz thinks of Luther. Lortz saw Luther as a religious man who can be assessed only in theological categories. Luther was the evangelist, the preacher of grace, proclaiming Christ crucified and salvation in his name. Lortz is fully aware of the deeply religious Luther who threw himself into the monastic life without reserve, of the Luther who immersed himself in Scripture, where he found a gracious God. That is so much different than the hundreds of years of Catholic scholars previous to him. It's just some other things that Joseph Lortz has said about Martin Luther. He calls him a theologian of the highest rank. So whereas some of the earlier Roman Catholic theologians or historians had said, Luther was, ignorant of church history, Joseph Lortz sees him as a high-ranking theologian. He says Luther belongs in the first rank of men with extraordinary intellectual creativity. He is, in the full sense, a genius, a man of massive power in things religious, and a giant as well in theological interpretation. And then also the next point, Lortz held that there is no doubt that Luther was a profoundly religious man, a true Christian who lived by a deep faith in Jesus Christ. What a contrast to what had been going on for hundreds of years within Roman Catholic apologetics and historical studies. Lortz also saw that Catholics were also to blame for stuff that happened during the Protestant Reformation. You will find Roman Catholics online now in dialogue with them that will admit, well, indulgences were a problem. Well, up until Lortz, there were a lot of Roman Catholic historians that really saw Luther as the primary blame for everything. There was no fault on Rome's side at all. Lortz, one final bullet point I have here is that he saw Erasmus as the real danger to the Catholic Church and not Luther. He said that Erasmus left little room for grace, sin, and redemption. So I find it interesting that for Lortz, he says Erasmus was much more dangerous than Luther. That's not to say that Lortz just believed everything that Luther said and did. He was still critical of Martin Luther. Lortz was into Thomism, and Thomism was the only legitimate Catholic theology. Since Luther was trained in Ockamism, Lortz held that Luther rejected a Catholicism which was basically not Catholic. So Lortz sees that the theology of Thomas Aquinas was the real official theology of the Roman Catholic Church, and Luther did not correctly understand that theology. He also accused Luther of being subjective, that Luther interpreted the scriptures according to his own personal interpretation. I bring these things up lest people think that I'm just trying to say all the modern Roman Catholic scholars agree with Martin Luther. They don't, but they're still able to evaluate Luther, his theology, without attacking him or coming up with all this false slander that the earlier periods did. One final point about Joseph Lortz is I was in a conversation or dialogue back in the mid-2000s with a Catholic apologist named Dr. Art Sippo, who was more well-known back then. I believe Dr. White actually debated Dr. Sippo. I think it was on justification by faith alone, and that was the debate where I think Dr. White says that Dr. Sippo, during James's presentation, Dr. Sippo went and got himself a Diet Coke or something like that rather than listen to the presentation. Well, so anyway, Dr. Sippo was talking about how bad and evil and corrupt Martin Luther was. And I said, well, hey, what about Joseph Lortz? What about these Catholic scholars that talk about how, good of a theologian was? Like, why aren't you using them? And he says, well, Joseph Lortz was a Nazi. And then Dr. Sippo went as far as to call me a Nazi as well, because I was mentioning Joseph Lortz. So just to set the record straight on that very briefly, yes, Joseph Lortz was involved in the Nazi Party in the 1930s. And by the late 30s, he wanted out. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. And you can see in my PowerPoint slide here some of the details of that. I won't get into it too deeply. But needless to say that Lortz did not want to remain in the Nazi Party, and he could not get out of it. And after the war, he went through a Nazi, what did I put? He went through a denazification process, and he was able to resume his career. And he lived, quite a few decades afterwards, and was still heralded as a tremendous theologian and scholar. He wasn't known as being a Nazi. To just briefly summarize then some of the people that came after Lortz, to just give you an overview of how Catholic scholarship, generally speaking, is so much more favorable to Luther than the first few hundred years. Keifel, that Luther, he was a scholar, Luther never denied good works or holy living. Rather, good works are the way in which faith expresses itself. That's what he saw Luther teaching. Sebastian Merkel, that Luther's motives were religious and pure. He was not a revolutionary, or there were no psychological factors determining the Reformation period. Anton Fischer, that Luther was a man of prayer. Adolf Hirt, he proved that, he was another Catholic scholar, he proved that all the Catholic biographies of Luther that simply echoed the vilification of the 16th century Catholic author Cochlaeus that we discussed earlier. Hessen, that Luther's theology is not based on subjectivism. So whereas you had Joseph Lortz saying that Luther was subjective, Hessen says he wasn't. Karl Adam, he credits Luther with an original understanding of the essence of Christianity and a passionate desire to reject whatever is not holy or of God. Yves Congar, I misspelled Yves just so I could remember to say it correctly. He said that the Reformation was a religious movement, an attempt to renew religion at its source. He considered Luther a profoundly religious man who had a deeply sensitive conscience and was obsessed by the longing to find peace of heart and a warm, living, consoling contact with God. Father Thomas Sertori, Luther, love inspired Luther. So love is at the heart of Luther's Reformation. Luther was a genuine religious personality. George Tavard, he said there's no real contradiction between Roman Catholic theology and Luther's gospel. So he would be one of these people where they try to find the common ground. Some of those people that say justification is by faith, but they leave out the word alone to make it seem like Rome and Protestants agree. Father Thomas McDonough, Luther had a true experience with the living God. His experience was the effect and fruit of God's objective external word. Leonard Swidler, the Reformation was needed. That means the Catholics could be blamed. John Todd, who was not a scholar of Roman Catholic, but an influential layman author, that Luther was honest. Harry McSorley, that Luther's protest was not an attempt to divide Christianity. Jared Wicks, within the vein of Joseph Lortz, he said that Luther is a forceful teacher of lived religion, a resource for the enrichment of personal spirituality for all members of the Christian confessions. So what a disconnect. what a disconnect between the earlier approaches to Martin Luther and the later. So why mention all these positive Roman Catholic scholars about Luther? And I've found, as I've interacted with Roman Catholics over the years online, and particularly laymen, they have no clue that the scholarly understanding from their own perspective is different than what they're saying. Most of the Catholic laymen that I've interacted with over the years, I'd say the high percentage of them are into the vilifying personal attacks against Martin Luther, and they have no idea of the literature since the 20th century in which Rome's theologians and historians have moved beyond that. So they rely on all this destructive criticism. I have here on my PowerPoint a Catholic Answers Forum priest story, which I'll just briefly mention. Is I was on the Catholic Answers forums for many years, and somehow or another I managed to not get banned. I was very, very careful when I was on there not to use the words together Roman and Catholic, because they took offense to that. It's just Catholic. I think I did get, I think the word was infraction. They infracted me for using the phrase Roman Catholic at one point. But I was never banned. I was never banned. But there was a retired Catholic priest on the Catholic Answers forums that understood the 20th century Roman Catholic historical approaches to Luther. And he would mention some of it, that Luther was not this mean, satanic, evil individual. He understood the more recent Roman Catholic scholarly literature. And the participants on Catholic Answers attacked him. They attacked a retired Roman Catholic priest on his understanding and interpretation of Luther. So obviously, some of this, a lot of, I should say more, a lot of this understanding of Luther comes with the ecumenical push within Roman Catholicism that's happened over the last 100 years or so, where we're no longer, Protestants are no longer heretics. We're separated brothers. We're still somehow or another in the church. We just don't have the full extent of the full pure Catholicism. We just have a fraction of it. So I think that plays into a lot of why Rome's scholars have actually had a more positive approach to Martin Luther. At least that's one reason of it. And just to conclude this presentation, there was the Roman Catholics apologetic revival, and I'm sure Dr. White could probably speak on this much more clearly than I could, because he's actually lived through it and was debating Roman Catholics during this time period. But there was this resurgence in Roman Catholic apologetics in the 1990s, and that's when the Catholic convert syndrome first really started to gain a lot of prominence. You had the Surprised by Truth book series put out by Patrick Madrid. Catholic Answers, came into existence, and there was the Coming Home Network with Marcus Grodi, where he was presenting conversion stories of ex-Protestants becoming Roman Catholic. And a lot of these stories included references to Martin Luther. Some of them included the destructive criticism that I've mentioned. Some of them included quotes from Father Patrick O'Hare's books. And it wasn't uncommon to find heavy use of the psychological approaches to Martin Luther that were put forth by, say, a Hartman Grisar, that Luther had some sort of mental deficiency and he should never have been a monk, and that Protestants are following this man that had mental issues. Also, there's a heavy use in the conversion stories of Luther's table talk. And just really quickly, there's a group of writings of Luther's that's called the Table Talk. They are statements that he did not actually write. They're collected sayings of things he's purported to have said by his friends and students. They followed him around with notebooks, and they kind of wrote down everything he said, even off the cuff. The problem with a lot of these statements is there's no context to why Luther said what he said. There's no date on them. Some of the things seem absolutely outrageous, and most of the stuff was all published after Luther's death. Well, you'll find that in a lot of these Catholic convert stories, they're relying on quotes from Luther that he might not have actually said, or if he did say them, the context is really unknown. And just to briefly end this presentation, this whole psychological approach to Luther, I find that it's not only within Roman Catholic treatments of Luther, that you'll find it in atheistic approaches to Luther and even some Protestant approaches to Luther, that there's something psychologically wrong with Martin Luther. Perhaps it's the culture we live in now. I find that this gets brought up all the time across the board by all different perspectives, you know, everything from, say, a heretical person not liking Martin Luther to a Roman Catholic person doesn't like Luther, to a Protestant person doesn't like Luther. A lot of them rely on these psychological approaches to Luther. So this presentation would not be complete without pointing out the person that most popularized the psychological approach to understanding Luther, and that would be the psychologist Erik Erikson in his groundbreaking book, Young Man Luther, from 1958. So Erikson used a modified Freudian approach to understanding Luther. And if you know anything about Freud, you understand that Freud argued that religious phenomena are to be understood on the model of the neurotic symptoms of the individual. So he had a materialistic outlook on religion. So fundamentally, Erik Erikson's psychological study on Luther is not our friend. It's not the friend of anybody that believes in the living triune God of the universe that has communicated infallibly through the sacred scriptures. So Erikson relied on some really poor documentation for his conclusions on Luther. He used this table talk source a lot of the times. And so his treatment of Luther was based on these secondhand reports of things either Luther said or did, or things about Luther's life. The whole process that Erikson used is something dubbed psychohistory. It's the idea of doing psychoanalysis on some historical figure, somebody that lived a long time ago, and just stop and think about that for a second. How can you possibly do psychoanalysis on somebody that's been dead for 400 or 500 years, that you're not seeing in person, that lived in a completely different historical context and spoke in a completely different language, if you're an English speaker, with a completely different culture? The whole thing is fraught in silliness. When you really think about it, there's been some pretty good refutations put out on the whole process of doing psychohistory. But bottom line, avoid those things because they're simply speculative, that like Luther was this neurotic nut. They don't know that. They've never, there's no way you can do psychology on a dead person. So just one brief example of something that Erik Erikson popularized and that you'll find still online is that's Erikson's interpretation of Luther's tower experience. So Erikson took a German phrase uttered by Luther and interprets it literally mean that Luther was sitting on the toilet in the Wittenberg monastery when he had his evangelical breakthrough. There was no toilet in the tower in the Wittenberg monastery. And the phrase that Luther used to describe his breakthrough was a colloquial term that meant down in the dumps. It means that Luther was going through a period of melancholy. We'll see Erikson seized on this account and turned it into like a biological, psychological type of event that can explain Luther's understanding of justification by faith alone. So with that, just to summarize, most Roman Catholic laymen doing apologetics are out of touch with, at least currently, what the Vatican says about Martin Luther. Not only Pope Francis, you can find some of the other popes in the last decades that have said very, very kind things about Martin Luther. And the question that should be asked is, why is a Roman Catholic layman giving me their opinion of Martin Luther? Why aren't they quoting the Vatican? Why aren't they quoting the Pope? Why aren't they following the Pope in the Pope's opinion of Martin Luther? Why are they privately interpreting the Reformation for themselves? Why do I have to believe their fallible opinion of what the Reformation is and was when they have an infallible authority that is supposed to tell them how to understand things? So that's my next point, that a lot of Roman Catholics tend to be their own authorities on history and the Reformation. The infuriating phrase that I like to use is that they're functionally Protestant when it comes to doing the history of the Reformation. So if you come across Roman Catholics that are really denigrating Luther and presenting a lot of negative quotes and information about how awful Luther is, they should be challenged on why they aren't following Catholic scholarship. Like, why are you relying on this old, outdated scholarship? Why aren't you relying on the best Roman Catholic historians now that are available? And also to challenge Roman Catholics or anyone really on this approach, this psychohistory approach, about how viable and accurate could it possibly be to do history on somebody that's been dead for hundreds of years. And so with that, I'll end my presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Great. That was super informative. I think that was a really, really good rundown. I added, I know I had a few questions that I had sent to you beforehand that I was planning on asking. I added a couple more when you were doing the presentation. But before we get to those, something that I wanted to ask, I probably should have asked it at the beginning, and you mentioned a little bit here or there, but how did you get into the business of tracking down false Luther quotes and dispelling misinformation about the Reformation?
Well, the clouds opened up and Luther looked down. Now, I was not raised with any sort of understanding of Reformation theology or Catholic theology, for that matter. I was raised a really garden variety, generic evangelical. For most of my younger life, I had no idea about Martin Luther. I probably couldn't tell him apart from Martin Luther King. I think Paul McCartney mentions Martin Luther in his song Let Him In from 1976. That might be the only way I understood who Martin Luther was. So I was driving home very late one night, and I was listening to AM radio, and I was listening to Christian radio. And usually the later at night it is on Christian radio, the more interesting, to use a kind word, that the broadcasts are, because people that can't afford to be on the prime time, they go on late at night. So I could hear some really wild stuff. And there was this, I turned on Christian radio and the AM signal is crackling in and out. And this guy is talking about Soren Kierkegaard. And I'm like, what in the world is this? And I'm listening to this guy, and it's this like really intellectual, wonderful explanation of Soren Kierkegaard. And I quick memorized the phone number. I was like, I'm going to get home, I'm going to order this guy's tapes. And it was R.C. Sproul. I'd never heard of R.C. Sproul before. You know, R.C. Sproul's kind of like the gateway drug into, things Protestant Reformation. Yeah. And from there, I heard some of Dr. Sproul's lectures on Martin Luther, and you could really tell that Dr. Sproul had such a profound respect for Martin Luther. I would think that he was into Luther, Calvin, and Edwards. I think Luther was his favorite, even though he wasn't a Lutheran. So from there, I actually ended up taking a seminary level class in Martin Luther, where I was, I was taught some of Luther's basic theology from a very clear perspective. And then, like a lot of people, at least of my age, we started to significantly get online in the early 2000s because we had modems that could actually keep up with the information. And so I started to try out my new Reformation theology online to interact with people about the Reformation. And back then, there wasn't Facebook, there wasn't YouTube, there wasn't Twitter. We had discussion boards. And so I would go on these discussion boards, and I was doing the generic interactions with Roman Catholicism about papal primacy, indulgences, veneration of Marian saints, all the typical Roman Catholic subjects. And what was interesting is that Luther kept being brought up, and they kept bringing up some of these outrageous quotes that I did not hear them either from Dr. Sproul or either from the class I had taken on Martin Luther. I was like, where are they coming up with that? Like Luther was into polygamy, and Luther was ripping books out of the Bible, and Luther was a drunk. So all these quotes started to come up. So I was like, you know what? I started looking online, and there wasn't as much available back then as there is today. I mean, I don't recall if Google had their Google Books feature, but there was not the same availability to check some of these quotes out. So I thought, yeah, I know what I need. I need Luther's works to check these quotes, to just see what's going on. I'm just curious. Sproul's telling me one thing. My seminary class is telling me one thing. The Roman Catholics online are telling me all this other stuff, that Luther was a polygamist. I'm like, what in the world's going on? So I figured out that I could buy the 55-volume set of Martin Luther's writings in English, or popular at the time was this new Bible software that was coming out. And I saw the Concordia had digitized Luther's works. I was like, that is it. I'm getting that. The 55 volumes of Luther's works digitized, and the format was called Libronics. And just an aside, Libronics, I miss you, Libronics. Logos is so hard to navigate through. It really drives me crazy. I still have Libronics on my old computer. So I got these quotes that these Roman Catholics were using, and I had a list of them, and I installed the Libronics program, the Martin Luther program, and there it is at my fingertips. I had all 55 volumes of Luther's works, even though I didn't realize there were other works of Luther that hadn't been translated. And I start plugging these quotes into the search engine. I didn't get any hits on any of them. They were all, I was like, what is going on? How could it be that Luther said all these things and I'm not getting one hit in his actual writings? I said, something's not right here. So I went back online, and this is all kind of an organic thing as I'm trying to figure this out. And I realized that Roman Catholics they're not citing Luther's works. They're citing books written by Roman Catholics from, say, the 1800s and the 1900s. And I thought, okay, I see what's going on. That's why the English quotes don't match up, because the English quotes in the Concordia edition are going to be worded differently than these ones from the 1800s and 1900s. So I thought, what I need now is I need to buy these Catholic books from the 1800s and the 1900s to find out what the documentation is. So then I start buying Roman Catholic books on Martin Luther. And I mean, had I known that a decade or so later, most of the books I bought would be available online for free, I could have saved a lot of money. But some of them I spent a lot of money on. So I have a big collection of books specifically written by Roman Catholics on Martin Luther, and I was able to find where these English quotes were, and then kind of and their documentation usually was better than what was being put on the internet at the time. I was able to cross-reference a lot of those quotes into Luther's works. So, like I said, I never intended to actually start looking up Martin Luther quotes. It just sort of happened. In fact, if you look at my blog in the early days, you'll notice that I wasn't just doing Martin Luther quotes. I was doing generic Roman Catholic things as well. But what had happened, I guess it's kind of like a puzzle. I enjoyed this textual criticism of trying to find out where these quotes come from. It's like going through a maze, and you're going through all this facts. Where did this come from? You're doing textual criticism to find out, how did this Luther quote wind up in English? Where did it come from? So eventually, if someone were to actually read my blog, you'll see that some of the earlier entries, I look back at them, like, I can't believe I wrote this. They're so messy. I have quite a formula now that I've worked out, where I kind of just state the conclusion, or state the introduction. I give the documentation, which is my favorite part. Then I do the context. Then I do a conclusion. So it just organically grew over the years, and it came to a point where I had some opportunities to be on some very very popular blogs. At one point I was submitting articles for Alpha and Omega Ministries. To have millions of people reading what you've written. And by the way, if you ever want to get yourself in a lot of trouble, just have Dr. White on. I'm sure you found that out. But I was so interested in Luther studies at this time. I just started to what? No one else is doing what I'm doing, and it's fun. It's actually, and I figured the only person, the way I look at it is, I think I'm probably the only person actually reading my blog. So I primarily write it for me, And you know, one of my family relatives actually read it at one point, and they said, "Yeah, it's just like a lot of stuff." I'm like, "Yeah, I know. It's just right for me. If I like it, I like it." So that's the longer answer.
It's awesome to hear. Yeah, for me, it's funny because I just very recently opened the blog to go with my channel as well. And it's kind of funny because the channel, I am primarily thinking of like, okay, how can I help people with this? And it's the same thing for the blog. But funnily enough, the blog, there's a little bit of a shift in mentality for me where I'm trying to think about the things I want to write. And it's more like, what are the things that I keep finding myself having to explain over and over and over and over again?
Yeah.
So that I can save myself time and just link someone to
Yeah.
something that I've written.
Yeah, no, good. That's a good point. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I actually started the blog, because I got tired of rewriting the same stuff on those discussion boards. I needed to put stuff someplace where, you know, I always accuse people of cutting and pasting. I'm the king of cut and paste. I cut and paste myself. I can't keep writing the same stuff over and over and over again. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so understanding that then when it comes to how you got started on this journey, right, that is still ongoing today, I want to kind of break down a few of the things that you mentioned in your presentation and things that you deal with on your blog all the time.
Right.
And so I find the example of Coclaeus and his contemporaneous treatment of Luther pretty interesting, especially as it relates to this question that I've had for a while that I myself need to do more research on when it comes to the historical method, which is how to gauge the trustworthiness of contemporaneous historical sources, specifically when they're involved in polemics, right? Because I feel like a lot of the time, and I'm not, you know, saying I have an answer per se, at least right now, but a lot of the time I find that people will give, whether it's a church father, whether it's a medieval theologian, whether it's someone on their team post-Reformation, where they'll just give them the benefit of the doubt, right, on a lot of these insults, right? When they say things like, "Oh, Luther was polygamous and Luther was this crazy, horrible person," they'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But if that exact same strategy today was being used of someone that is on their team that they like, they would just write it off as like, whatever, you're just insulting this person or you're making things up. But they give this a lot of weight just because I guess it happened a couple hundred years ago. And so how would you say that we should weigh and evaluate the claims of these kind of polemical sources like that?
Yeah, the one phrase that I've used a lot on discussion boards over the years is the phrase "Hooray for our side!" You know, our side's great. Yeah, it's people reason from the heart. You know, there's this whole idea of, you know, the mind and the heart, but people are emotional. They reason from their heart. It's really hard for all of us, myself included, to really evaluate fairly what someone is saying. And there's no such thing as unbiased history. I mean, history, to find some unbiased source, it's not possible, because people always reason from their heart. What I look for is I look for people. I look for people that are willing to be critical of their own side as well. That makes me think, hey, you know what? This person is able to honestly see that, yes, there's problems on the other side, but hey, we've got these problems on our side as well. So even though I realize that everybody has a bias, I'm more tempted to listen to somebody like that. Even thinking in the political realms these days, you know, I remember during COVID, going, you know, sitting there, you know, being locked in the house, and I would flip back and forth between CNN and Fox News, and, you know, both of them were just telling their audiences what those audiences wanted to hear. And I thought, well, wait a minute, not everything that CNN says is wrong, and not everything Fox says is right. You know, it was kind of hard to navigate through it. It's the same thing kind of with these historical sources. I'm looking for people that, even if they're on my side, if they can point out some sort of deficiencies within their own worldview or weaknesses, I'm more prone to listen to them. Now, in terms of historical, theological sources, that can be very, very difficult. Especially I've found Luther errors and mistakes even in Protestant sources, where they've gone the opposite extreme, where they make Luther into this saint, where, you know, Luther was a guy with faults, sins, and warts. So I don't have an easy answer for what you're asking, other than, I love documentation, seeing how people arrived at their conclusions. I will look at the facts and see if the facts lead to a particular conclusion. And I don't care who's saying it. I mean, if it's some theologian I like, if I look at the facts and it's not right, well, hey, it's not right. So I don't always give a lot of credence right off the bat just because I agree with somebody on our side.
I think it's good advice, right? It's always it always makes me laugh a little bit in these conversations how much the answer to a lot of our issues today are parallel with the answers in the Reformation, which is ad fontes. Right? We need to go back to the sources, and we need to who actually said this, and do we have it even documented anywhere? But so something I find similarly fascinating, right, as people listening to these highly polemical, it's as you mentioned, kind of in your presentation, tracing this out, especially early on, is the content of these polemical treatises, where most of them early on, and even up until not very long ago in history, seem to be simply made up of just moral issues to impugn Luther with, right? Mm-hmm. And like you said, even psychoanalyzing him on the basis of other people having impugned them with these issues. And so what I find myself incredibly frustrating about that, and I'm curious as to your thoughts as to why you think people do this, is it's not even like you have to go out and get Luther's 55 volume. You don't have to do any of that. It's, for me, all I needed to do was just pick up online and like bookofconcord.org and read Luther's small and large catechisms.
Yeah.
And it's like, look at what he says about the Ten Commandments. It's
a disconnect. Yeah.
It's like he's not an antinomian. He's not saying like, oh man, now we have to do whatever we want. It's the exact opposite of that. And it's freely, it's like we live in the age of the internet, right? Like it's freely available. Like people can go and find it. It takes a Google search.
Oh, we're still laughing.
People don't do that, right? And they'd rather just be, like you said, kind of, it appeals to the heart and it sways people. But why do you think a lot of these critiques, and there seems to be a resurgence at this time online, why do so many of these polemical critiques only deal with just coming up with moral issues, or even mentioning the moral issues that are legit? Why do you think that they do that as opposed to the content of his theological writings?
Because it's emotional. The emotional stuff grabs you. It's the same thing with the TV news. The news stories, the emotional ones, grab you. They grab. People want to have views and likes and hits, and they want people to listen to what they're saying. If you say something emotional, I mean, if that's more interesting, more appealing than just say, talking about some aspect of Luther's some of Luther's theology, some of it can be very, very dull, but it's very technical theology. But nobody's interested in that because it's not a fun topic, or it's not a sexy topic. I don't know how you would say it. And so people and also they're easier topics to talk about. It's much easier to talk about, was Luther a polygamist, than it is what is Luther's view of the Lord's Supper. It's just, and we're just lazy people. I find that infuriating and frustrating as well too. Is the source now? Back in the early 2000s, I could understand that there weren't as many sources online, but now everything is online. Everybody could do what I do, and it doesn't take all that much energy. And I like the way you brought up Lutheran creeds and confessions to find out exactly what the Lutheran Church believes, even what Luther believed, how he wanted himself to be remembered. He didn't want himself to be remembered for some small minor treatise that he wrote. In fact, he even said, I wish some of my stuff would just disappear, just get rid of it. It's just, like a lot of junk, but just stick with, the collected wisdom that the creeds put forth that accurately describe the Lutheran Church, especially the whole idea about the necessity of good works and their place in the Christian life. These people that accuse Luther of being an antinomianism, they're just clueless. They don't. Yeah, go ahead.
Especially on that issue, because it's like, hey, do you know who coined the label antinomian?
Yeah, exactly.
It was Luther.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, excellent point. Yeah.
It's like he was dealing with these guys. It's something that to me is also very frustrating because a lot of these quotes, most of them end up being just false. They end up being from people that hate Luther and they're coming up with stuff. But even, for example, when Luther does have a really bad one-off sentence, or he has even a really bad treatise, right? Like his treatise on the Jews and their lies, which we all say, hey, you know what? That was really bad,
Right.
right? Like no one's going to sit here and say, no, Luther, that was really cool. No, that was really bad. But even then, something that I find interesting is a lot of people will, and again, I always talk about these double standards that I find in Protestant and Roman Catholic polemics, and both sides do it, right? But one really big one where we bring up, hey, here's all these popes, whatever. It doesn't matter what the pope is doing morally. It matters that he's infallible. Well, hey, listen, here's some weird stuff that's going on with some of your medieval theologians. Well, it doesn't really matter, right? Like, but suddenly when it comes to Luther, it's like he could never be a sinner, right? He could never make a misstep. Or suddenly, why would you listen to anything he ever has to say? And what I wonder sometimes, it's like, man, with these same people, to your point, right? How did he want to be remembered? Would these same people think of their own legacy in that way, right? Like, oh, I really hope that people will just say stuff about me after my death, and on a couple sentences that maybe I said, maybe I didn't say, no one should listen to anything I ever believed, thought, had to say, no contributions ever, because of one or two bad one-off comments I made that one time.
Yeah, good. No, that's an excellent point. We're experiencing that so much now in the culture with this, the cancel culture. Somebody says one thing and their lives are ruined. But to put it in a theological framework, to do church history, to study anybody in church history, whether it's a Roman Catholic type person, whether it's an early church father, whether it's a reformer, whether it's Charles Wesley, whether it's Finney, somebody you might not disagree with. Whenever we venture online to write about these people or to critique them, we're still under the obligation to love our neighbor as ourselves. And these people from church history are our neighbors, and some of them are our brothers and sisters in Christ. So we have the responsibility to love them as ourselves. So that means we must treat these people as fairly as possible, especially give them the benefit of the doubt as well. And like you bring up a good example, is like, why would you hold somebody accountable for one or two stupid things they said, where their entire body of work says the opposite? And the example of Luther's on the Jews and their lives is a great example, because the guy, it's a horrific treatise. And I, even my opinion on Luther's treatment of the Jews has shifted over the last 20 years. When Roman Catholics, if they bring that subject up, that Luther was this anti-Semite, here's the double standard again. If you go back and you read the actual papal bulls against Luther and the Lutherans, they were saying, take their possessions, they're enemies of the state. They should not be, they should not be allowed to be here. They were doing the same sort of stuff that Luther's recommending to do to the Jews. So it's quite a double standard. I find it very, very fascinating.
And we can either look back at history and say, hey, maybe this is horrific across the board, and no one should have been saying this. Or even again, sometimes I wonder, the same people that will say, and again, just as clearly as people at home can hear it, right? That treatise from Luther is horrific. It's really bad. No one here is going to stand up and defend it. But what I find interesting is putting that into the wider context. I remember I was listening to a lecture from a few years ago by Dr. Carl Truman on this issue. So he had multi-part lecture series, phenomenal series. It's on the Reformation, but like he says, it's 90% about Luther, really. And he had one entire lecture dedicated to this issue of Luther and his treatise on the Jews and their lies. And he says, like, hey, man, this is a horrific treatise. This is really bad. Like, this is not, a Christ-like behavior. But what he says is fascinating to him as a historian, if I can remember him correctly, is he was saying that as a historian, what you really have to explain, and when you have to ask questions about looking back at history, is when things stand out. So he gives an example, if I remember correctly, like, let's say that someone's looking back at this period in Britain, and they hear of someone having, there's two different cases. Case one, someone has a person over at their house, and when they come over to their house, there's cricket on the TV, they're making crumpets, they offer them tea, they're very private with the different rooms of their house, the doors are closed. And in case number two, when the person invites somebody over, they're watching American baseball, they're serving burgers and fries, they're not as private with the rooms in the house, you're kind of open, they walk in and out. And he says, well, the one that you really have to explain is the second one of these instances. The first one is actually very common, right, in England at this point.
Mm.
And so what he was getting at with that is, as horrific as this is from Luther, sadly so, this is kind of characteristic. This attitude toward Jewish people is very common in the Middle Ages.
Yes.
And it's very common at the time of Luther. And it's very sad, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, if we could turn back time, I wish that no one had this opinion, but this is, and Luther was very aggressive with this opinion, but this was an opinion that was common at the time.
Yeah.
But even that, right? Even that, and I'm sure like you document as well in your blog, even that gets twisted and turned though, because then they turn that into, oh, this is the exact same racial sentiment that the Nazis had much later. And as bad as Luther's treatise is, and as much as he should not have been saying any of that about the Jewish people, his treatise was the theological one, right? It wasn't even in the same playing field as the even worse stuff that the Nazis were doing later. But even that, right? There's no context. It's just, how can we make Luther look the worst possible, and how can we ignore the things that our own medieval theologians have said, and the things that our own church fathers that we really like have said, and let's just use double standards. And that's a very unfortunate game, but it's a game that gets played online all the time.
Sure.
And so my next question for you is, maybe we've covered a few of these already in your presentation in here, but what are a few common examples of those really pernicious fake Martin Luther quotes or stories that you hear repeated most often, and you're like, oh, I just got to send them the link to to an article I read?
Yeah, it's funny is when I first started doing the blog, I used to describe it as shooting fish in a barrel, because there were so many of these quotes around. I don't get on as much of these discussions as I used to anymore, for a couple of reasons. Number one, I really don't enjoy Facebook discussions, and I don't know how to do Twitter, and I haven't been in the YouTube discussions. I'm sure they're all still there. I don't see them as much as I used to, but I'm sure they're all still out there floating around. Not all the Luther quotes are just these real bad Luther quotes that are floating around out in cyberspace. There's actually a lot of really good ones. Like, Luther gets stuff attributed to him that he never said. There's these little meme pictures. One in particular that I pulled up as an example is, there's a picture of Luther meme that's I don't have a screenshot of it, but Luther is purported to have said, "For feelings come and feelings go, and feelings are deceiving. My warrant is the word of God. Naught else is worth believing." Now, that's a great quote. Luther did not say it. First of all, it rhymes in English. So how is it? Yeah, how is it that Luther wrote it in German or Latin, and somebody was able to rhyme it in English? And it's actually the same problem with "The Mighty Fortress is Our God." I often wonder how that actually rhymes in English. I never quite figured that one out yet. That's another mystery that I've yet to solve. But I actually studied that quote. I looked at it. I found out that it was actually a Lutheran pastor in the 1900s that was contributing articles to a Sunday school journal, and he used to like to make poems about Martin Luther and the Reformation. So it was actually a poem he wrote about Martin Luther. And so, but now it's all over the internet as if like Luther actually said it. And I'll find it on a Facebook post or something like that, and I'll say, yeah, great, but Luther didn't write it, and here's the link. And I never get a response. Never. I never get one. So, but people would rather like, no, Luther said it. Anyway, some of the quotes, the ones that really interest me more than any of the others, and it's some of the stuff I got into very early on when I started looking up these quotes, is I'm really fascinated by Luther's alleged venerating and honoring Mary quotes. Here's why they fascinate me so much. I just did that whole presentation of how all these hundreds of years of Catholics that think Luther is this horrific, horrible person that was an adulterer, and he was terrible, and he was psychologically nuts, and he was subjective, and he ruined the church. And then all of a sudden, there's all these quotes from Martin Luther about that you should honor and venerate Mary. But hey, guess what? You should follow Luther on that. I'm like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. How is it you're just telling me he's this like awful, terrible person, but now he's saying all this nice stuff about Mary, and like now we should follow him? Like, I don't get it. And I remember one Roman Catholic apologist wrote back and he's like, well, like, you know, when Luther says something right, you know, we affirm that's right. I'm like, nah, that doesn't, oh, come on, really? One of the first quotes I actually got into on this whole topic, where there was a real disconnect. I read it and I said, no way. It was that Luther believed in the Immaculate Conception of Mary. So go back to 2004, 2003, 2005, whenever it was, and I came across this sentiment being put forth out there that Luther was so honored and venerated Mary so much that he even believed in her sinlessness, the sinlessness of her entire life. I thought, wow, that's amazing to me. I mean, Luther's bondage of the will, you know, this whole idea of the need for Christ to set you free from the bondage of sin. And, you know, Luther is this theologian of Christ and Christ's importance. Wait a minute, Mary's getting a free pass from, you know, the bondage of the will. What is going on here? So the quote that that was really, really popular at the time, and I'll just read a section of it, that Luther believed in the Immaculate Conception. And this is still out there to this day. Luther is purported to have said, "It is a sweet and pious belief that the infusion of Mary's soul was effected without original sin." And the quote is longer than that, but that's the basic gist of it. And it's said to come from the sermon on the day of the conception of the Mother of God. And I'm like, wait a minute, R.C. Sproul didn't tell me anything about this. My Luther class didn't tell me anything about this. You mean to tell me Luther believed that Mary was immaculate conceived and like lived her entire life sinless? Wow. So I tried to start looking up this quote. And back then, you really couldn't find any meaningful sources to document it. Especially the sermon, like the documentation they gave you was sermon on the day of the conception of the Mother of God, 1527. Okay, great. So I remember I went to seminary, Westminster Seminary's library, and I start scouring through all these books to try to find this. And I ended up back with Hartman Grisar, who I mentioned previously, buried in a footnote on the fourth volume of Luther, Volume 4, in his massive set, is this quote about, "It is a sweet and pious belief that the infusion of Mary's soul was effected without original sin." So whatever Roman Catholic had originally put this quote online had to have had this book, had to have had Hartman Grisar, Volume 4, you know, probably back in the day, you know, typed it out and put it online and said that Luther believed in the Immaculate Conception. But wait, there's more. Like, Grisar actually doesn't stop there, right? So let me just look at my other screen for a second. This is what he says. Right after he says this quote, he goes, "The sermon was taken down in notes and published with Luther's approval. The same statements concerning the Immaculate Conception still remain in a printed edition published in 1529. That's 2 years later. Mm-hmm. Then he goes, but they, in later editions, which appeared during Luther's lifetime, they disappear." Okay? So the sermon's reprinted, but these statements about Luther believing in the Immaculate Conception aren't there anymore. And Grisar doesn't stop there. He actually explains why. Okay? This is according to him. He says, "As Luther's intellectual and ethical development progressed, we cannot naturally expect the sublime picture of the pure Mother of God, the type of virginity, of the spirit of sacrifice and of sanctity to furnish any great attraction for him. And as a matter of fact, such statements as the above are no longer met with in his later works." So Grisar's saying that he doesn't say this stuff anymore. So whatever Roman Catholic actually copied this out of a book, left it out purposely. Unbelievable. So then I had a Roman Catholic person chastise me for years of how stupid I was to not believe in this. And I kept saying, look, you know, there's no evidence that Luther believed in the Immaculate Conception, at least later in his life, after his Reformation career. And finally, the person like admitted I was right, but it took about a decade. And what's interesting about this quote, and this will be the last thing on it, is the editors of Luther's works say something very interesting about it. Just very recently, that they've come out with new volumes of Luther's works. Not only was the section removed, there's a really good chance that Luther never wrote it in the first place, because the person that published the sermons They did so with Luther's approval, but when Luther got a hold of the volume of the sermons, he was like, "This is awful." He made his own edition of it because the guy was actually adding content to Luther's sermons. Something people don't even realize with Luther's sermons. Luther, a lot of the sermons he didn't write. Somebody else either heard him say it, so we're working off notes. And then even in Luther's sermons on Genesis from Luther's works, the editors of Luther's works tell you, there's stuff in these sermons that Luther actually really didn't say that's been edited in. But this one on the Immaculate Conception just drives me crazy because it's so obviously whatever Catholic apologist put it online didn't even put the right information there, just took the quote. And now 20 years later, Roman Catholics are still out there saying Luther believed in the Immaculate Conception, and here's the proof.
Yeah. Well, and the sad thing is, a lot of the time it isn't. So a lot of the time it is just these lone actors. But sometimes I've seen examples of this also being the case in official Catholic Answers articles. Like you've cited several already. This is the case with some supposedly scholarly works that people really love on the Roman Catholic side of things. And so I know we've already touched on this, and so we can move on from it if you want. But if you have another comment to add, I mean, what is the strategy here, right? Like why do you think they do this, especially when you find out that they're like this person, clearly whoever it was, being dishonest, that they have to get around all this context to just get that quote, right? Like what is the strategy here? Right? Why do you think they do this in the first place? And why is the strategy, I mean, ultimately deficient?
Well, we've touched on this a little bit. What I've seen over the years is the mantra that your church started in the 16th century. Our church started with Jesus. So it's this idea is that Martin Luther is a little bit like Joseph Smith. He invented this religion, whereas that we are the true church. So anything to disparage Luther for being a false prophet is put forth. Anything to disparage him at all, just saying, listen, this is not Christian at all. This is heresy. This is a sect. This isn't the true church. So they will try to disparage Luther however possible they can to show that this church that only started in the 16th century was false, and this guy was a false teacher. He was a heretic. It's obviously an example of the genetic fallacy. Number one, that they do that. But secondly, like the way out of that, as I see it, is if you get in discussions with Roman Catholics or Orthodox people like this, is to not agree to the premise, because I believe that church history, since the first century or since the closing of the New Testament canon, that's my history as well. That's not Roman Catholic. They do not own church history. It is not trademarked Roman Catholic. It's not trademarked Orthodox. They do not own the church fathers. Luther didn't think they owned the church fathers. Calvin didn't think they owned the church fathers. Those men saw that those that came before them were members of the Catholic Church, of which they were members of. I mean, the most outrageous thing I could think of is that at the Council of Trent, Trent anathematized the gospel and is itself the sect that has gone away from the true church. So that's how I understand the end game, why they're doing that. I mean, you might have some other, you've been dealing with Roman Catholics more recently than I have. Has it changed at all, or is that?
No, it's the exact same talking. It's the exact same talking points. It's always, and by the way, I guess a fun fact here, because I've also lately been keeping up with the Hispanic apologetics side of things for Protestants. Across languages is the same thing. It's always the same talking points. It's who started your church. Yeah. Jesus founded our church. Luther founded yours, or Wesley founded yours, or Calvin founded yours. Yeah. It's always oh well, when you look back at history, it's you guys are like Mormons. Literally everything that you just said is exactly the same, both in the Anglo-speaking sphere and the Spanish-speaking sphere. Wow. It's exactly the same talking points, and it's just it to some degree it's just very sad. And it's interesting because I was watching another Roman Catholic apologist, Alan Roll, something like that is his name. I haven't watched a lot of his content, but he and this other guy, Bellarmite, who's also a Roman Catholic. They did a response to my video with James White. They were actually pretty respectful. I actually had a good time watching their response. Disagreed with a lot of the things they said, but in watching that, it's like one of the things they said is like, well, I feel like Javier's channel deals a lot with these low-hanging fruit, like Roman Catholic polemics. And part of my thinking, and when I put a comment under their videos, like, that is true, but part of the reason that I have to do that is because, man, people will convert, right? People will hear, hey, Jesus founded my church, Luther founded your church, and it sends them spiraling, and they end up converting, like having never researched the actual issues, right? You hear people say, oh, well, Luther added alone to the Bible. Did you know that James, the only time that faith alone is mentioned is when James condemns it? And it's these very low-level polemics that have been dealt with in some of the Reformation. But really, these are the ones that grab people. These are the ones that, back when I was really anxious about this stuff, those are the same things that kind of sunk their claws into me a little bit. Sure. And praise the Lord, I had good resources that I was able to find that dealt with these things. But for a lot of people, if you don't put out content helping deal with some of these polemics, or I'm sure even in your blogging space, right, there are some quotes, like you said, it's like, wow, this is so patently ridiculous. But if no one says anything about it, then it'll just effectively take some people out of the faith.
Yeah, that's an excellent point you raise, and I for the life of me, I don't understand why specifically the Lutheran Church or the people at Concordia are not more interested in, you know, getting down into the trenches where we are and just, you know, putting out a book on the facts about Luther and addressing some of this popular stuff. Now, in the past, some Lutheran writers have done that. You know, you'll find books in the early 20th century where they actually did that. They went through the popular charges that were being thrown out about Luther and the Reformation and just refuting them. So I'm just wondering, you know, I guess, you know, is it up to me to write this book? I mean, I don't know. I'm just curious. I mean, I know I've seen that you on your channel that you've interviewed some Lutheran folks. That would be a really good question to ask them. Like, why isn't your church coming out with even more stuff? Listen, I know the Lutheran Church doesn't worship Martin Luther. I know that they don't think that he's, you know, a saint or divine or an infallible interpreter of the Bible. But still, like you say, people are sucked in by these really weak arguments. So put something out on a popular level that addresses it. You know, I think it would be a good idea.
No, I agree. I think it's a great point. And so, all right, I have a final last couple questions here as we wind down here in this interview. And one is, in light of all this stuff, right, we've covered a lot of the ones that we hear online, some of these quotes, some of the attitudes that you've covered in your own presentation historically. Have you ever contacted any Roman Catholic organizations, journals, maybe even Catholic Answers or authors that you found utilizing fake Martin Luther quotes and like try to tell them about it? And if so, how did they respond?
All right, just a couple quick stories. Number one, I don't recall ever actually going out of my way to say contact a Catholic Answers or a Patrick Madrid or Tim Staples and say, hey, listen, you know, this quote or this thing you're doing is not right. I don't think I've ever done that. That's not to say I haven't interacted with a number of those people. But some years back, I was online doing something and I found my articles on the Catholic understanding of Luther being put on a Catholic website, and they took my name off. And I was like, wow, they just stole both of the articles and stuff. So I wrote them and I said, hey, listen, I appreciate that you're a Catholic website and you're using my articles, but you're not crediting me. And so they actually did credit me, which I don't remember what site it was. I've had interactions with some of the more well-known Catholic apologists over the years over these Luther quotes, but I have not, and maybe shame on me, maybe I should have wrote these guys privately and say, hey, I'm about to publish something that you said, and I'm going to, you know, evaluate it. You know, maybe that's something I should have done in the past, but I haven't. The interesting thing is that I have contacted a couple Protestants that have used Martin Luther kind of unfairly or not correctly. One was a pretty well-known blog with a lot of Reformed writers on it. They were pretty well known. The one person in particular, I can't exactly remember his name. He was a church history professor, I think, at a college. And I read this article that he wrote on Luther, and I was like, man, I've read this before. And it was actually a plagiarized, kind of sort of rewritten, like a plagiarized account of something called the Combustible Luther, where people in the 17th century thought that Luther was a saint because he could never be set on fire. So there was actually a study done on that by another scholar. And so I found this guy, this history professor, kind of regurgitating all this other professor's stuff. So I wrote the guy, or I left a comment saying, hey, I think, very kindly, I said, hey, I think that this material is very similar to this other writer. What do you think? And, they wouldn't publish my comment. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I contacted a couple other bloggers. I remember one in particular was Steve Hayes. I don't know if you've ever read any of Steve's work. And I said, hey, what should I do about this? Should I actually, critique something on my blog about this? And he said, yeah, call it out. And there was a couple other bloggers I did too. So I respectfully said, listen, this blog is plagiarizing this article. And lo and behold, a couple days later, all of a sudden that blog article changed, which I thought was pretty interesting. Another example from a Protestant perspective on this is that I left a comment on someone's Facebook page or somebody's blog or something. They were using a lot of bad Luther information, and I was respectful about it. And the guy retracted a bunch of the comments, which I thought was nice. And then a month or two later, the guy wrote me a letter, and right out of the blue. And he said, listen, he goes, I really enjoyed the fact that you corrected all that information. He goes, that information was for a book I'm writing that's going to be published. Would you actually go through the book and check all my research, and I'll pay you? Sure. You're going to pay me money to do what I like doing? I would love to do that. So I actually did that. I proofed the guy's entire book on stuff about Luther, Calvin, C.S. Lewis. I had a great time doing it. But, I really learned that, some people, really can take constructive criticism, and, do not have to be hostile encounters with people.
And that's one of the things for me. It's like, and especially on YouTube, you see this, everything is just charged with animosity, and it's like everyone feels the need, we got to dunk on each other. And you have stuff happen where it's like, sometimes I just did a video recently. This happened with William Albrecht and Sam Shamoon, where they just honestly, from their video, they hate James White so much that they just misunderstood. They just completely misunderstood something that he said, and they did a 2-hour stream responding to their misunderstanding of what he had said on my channel. And it's like, and it's just insult after insult. And it's like, but man, why the animosity, right? Like if you thought that something was wrong, why, instead of immediately jumping to, this is dishonesty, this is why not just be like, well, hey, maybe you got something wrong, and seeing what the response is, right? And it's funny, I'll mention one example, which, well, it's not from your blog. It is my blog by another friend of mine. It's called 3 Pillars Blog.
Yep. And
he tracked down, I don't know if you've seen this one, but he tracked down the Luther quote, which I'm sure you've probably dealt with on your blog as well. The quote is supposedly, quote, "Who among us could have foreseen how much misery, corruption, scandal, blasphemy, ingratitude, and wickedness would have resulted from it?" It being the Reformation, right?
Yeah.
"Only see how the nobles, the burghers, and the peasants are trampling religion underfoot. I have had no greater or severer subject of assault in my preaching. When the thought arose in me, thou art the sole author of this movement." End quote. And while you were saying this, I looked it up just to double check on his blog. Yeah, it's still there. Catholic Answers. It's an article by Steve Weidenkopf, utilizing this fake quote. And my friend Scott from 3 Pillars Blog, he tracked down this quote. He reached out to the author of it. He originally, if I remember correctly, was responding via email, and then he just stopped. And to this day, Catholic Answers has it on their website. He's reached out to people, take it down, and they haven't.
Wow.
And so, it's one of those things where it's like, on the one hand, we should assume the best of each other when we can, right? And it's like, oh, hey, you made a mistake. Or like, for example, Scott reaching out, Three Pillars blog, hey, I think you made a mistake here. Or I don't think you realized that the source that you were citing was citing another source that was like self-referential, and there was no source as to where it came from. And it's one thing when you reach out and, like in your example, right, where people respond well and they're like, actually, hey, would you help me figure out what I did wrong? How can I fix this situation? But it can also be a different sort of situation when the person doesn't care and they stop responding, they leave the quotes up. And I guess that kind of shows us where people are at when it comes to the honesty of the dialogue sometimes.
Yeah, I've interacted with that quote, and I think I've actually interacted with material from that particular person at Catholic Answers. Was he the gentleman that was a convert from Reformed Christianity? I think so. If I recall correctly, I might be mistaken, but I definitely have articles on him on my blog. I've gone through some of his Luther information over the years. Yeah, I mean, and those quotes like that, they're from the genre of Luther regretted the Reformation. There's a whole genre of those quotes, and I have a list of them on my website. And the basic thing you could even say about that is, even if Luther did say something like that, Luther was not post-millennial. He really believed that the world was getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, he thought it was the end of the world. So he expected the church to be harassed, beaten down, that only the smaller number of the church was going to survive until the end. So,
well, our final question for you here, and again, I feel like you've covered some of this, but just for people at home, I always like kind of leaving on a practical note for people. And so what are some good research strategies that you would recommend to Protestants when they hear a quote that they're like, man, I don't think that sounds quite right. Maybe it's eyebrow raising and it's attributed to Luther, or it's attributed to Calvin, or it's attributed to Melanchthon, or whoever it may be. What are some solid research strategies? Like, what are some steps that you would give to people as far as trying to search those quotes out?
All right. The first strategy I'm going to give you is a malicious strategy. And I just can't help it because it's my nature to be sarcastic. It's if I see a Luther quote and it's got a German reference or a Latin reference behind it, so it's in English, but it's got a German reference or a Latin reference, the first thing I do is I thank the people for taking so much time and effort to actually cite Luther and to translate him into English. I was like, wow, what a lot of work that must have taken for you to actually spend the time to translate German and Latin for us. Wow, thank you so much. Well, the obvious point is that they haven't looked the quote up at all. The second strategy, and it's so much easier to do now than it did when I first started doing this, is you Google the exact quote or just a phrase from the quote, and you see how it's being used. And sometimes you find even the paragraph that the person has wrote the quote they placed it in, that whole entire paragraph has been lifted from Catholic Answers or from an EWTN. So the other aspect of that is to actually Google the quote using either the Internet Archives book search or the Google book search as well. And you might actually find the actual context of it, which you couldn't do, 15, 20 years ago. But now you can actually some of these quotes are fairly easy now to locate. It's not, had I had the same resources now that I had, 10 or 15 years ago, had I been able to do what I do now, I would have saved myself a lot of time and effort. But like I think you kind of intimated before, there's really no excuse for people to actually Google this information to find it. So that would be my next thing to tell people to do. And really, it's not that hard. The third thing to do is if somebody brings up a Luther quote that sounds suspicious, ask them to produce the context. Oh, okay, great. You read this in a context. What's the context? What's the context of this statement? Even with Luther, it's not even just the written context. It's the historical context as well. What was going on in Luther's life when he said this particular thing? Where was he in his own theological development? For instance, like a quote from Luther on Mary. Like if you find quotes from Luther on Mary, when did he make them? Did he make them in 1545 or did he make them in 1519? There's a difference in Luther's Marian comments from 1519 to 1543, 1544. So tell people to produce the context. Tell them to exegete the context. I mean, as Christians, exegete the context is very important. Well, that applies to early church fathers, Reformation, to anything anybody writes. What is the context? And then finally, if you're interacting with, say, a Roman Catholic, particularly on Martin Luther, you ask them, and this goes back to my entire presentation that I've done here, why should I trust their fallible interpretation on Martin Luther? Theirs is a fallible historical perspective on Martin Luther. Why are they authorities on Martin Luther? Why are they not at least following some of the decrees from the Vatican on Martin Luther? Like, why are you saying all this horrific stuff about Martin Luther, whereas your scholars and your popes are saying something different? Why are you an infallible authority on history?
Yep. No, that's good. And so, well, James, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a treat having you on. One of the things that I always say this every single interview, because I always forget to ask it beforehand, but at some point after we finish up recording here, if you can send me a list of sources that you think are really beneficial for people as far as knowing the things that Luther said, maybe even some of the ones you showed during your presentation, as far as understanding where some of this slander comes from originally. And then I'll put those together in a list. I'll put it up for free on my locals for people to go out there and check it out.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so that'll be really cool. But thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we wrap up recording here?
No, I think that's it. I appreciate being on your YouTube broadcast. Thank you for reading my blog, and for the other 3 people that read the blog, I appreciate them too as well. And keep doing what you're doing. I think it's I've watched some of your recordings, and it's really it's trench work. It's the work that a lot of people aren't willing to do, and very, very, very valuable what you're doing. Thank you.
Really appreciate that. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see you later.